gratifying to see and learn more about. So just a quick report out. I'm hoping other groups selected a story or two to share with the larger group. And I know in my group, I elected Jack from Avonra Development to share who he is, what his firm does, and where he's coming from on housing issues. So Jack, are you able to hear us? Are you back in the larger group?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
No,
yeah, great. Well, I am traveling, so if I drop off, I'll try to dial back in.
Okay,
but,
thanks, Jack.
My name is Jack Franks. Yeah, Jack Franks from Walpole, New Hampshire. Avenue Development Group. Yeah, we primarily do commercial real estate development, market rate development, and affordable housing development. We work with New Hampshire Housing. And you may or may not know, we just recently put up a 22-unit affordable housing project, phase 2 in Walpole, New Hampshire. We put it up in 158 days from start to finish using modular technology that my company developed. We did so for about $30,000 less per unit than the maximum allowed for affordable housing projects in New Hampshire. And as I had predicted, phase 2 outperformed phase 1 from an energy efficiency standpoint. We participated in a study that New Hampshire Housing did several years ago with regards to energy consumption, the EIU index, and our phase 1 project proved to be the most energy efficient building that New Hampshire Housing tested in that process. Over 100 projects were tested, and we were the most energy efficient building. Phase 2 just outperformed phase 1 by 14.8%, which is remarkable. So to put it into layman's terms, we heated 23,000 square feet this past winter, 22 apartment units for $4,896, which breaks down to roughly $37.09 per unit per month over a 6-month period. A lot of time and energy has gone into developing this process. I have a background in aeronautical science and thermodynamics, so we put good education to use to try to develop a process that will save New Hampshire Housing tax credits with every project that we do, time in putting a project up, and then our carbon footprint is greatly reduced because of the process as a whole. I'd like to speak a little bit, if I may, about this group, and I think it's great that this discussion is happening on a regular, consistent basis. I'd like to see more effort put towards legislative process. As some of you may or may not know, I'm working on a project in Swansea, New Hampshire, working on one hopefully with Joanne Carr out in Jaffrey, working on a project right now up in Newport, New Hampshire. And it's challenging to pull all the pieces together from the perspective of just getting the development done. Then you've got to argue and fight in most cases with very aggressive groups that don't want to see affordable housing in their communities. It's a fact. I mean, I'm dealing with it right now in Swansea. We had to file a lawsuit against the town, and I'd like to see some effort put towards more legislation to keep townships, municipalities across the state between the yellow and the white line, not acting outside the scope of their authority, and making it more difficult for them to do that. And for some of these activist groups that come out that don't want those people there, I'd like to see some legislation that causes them to have to put some money up, and that there are repercussions if they lose. I know there was some that was proposed by New Hampshire Housing with the governor's office this year that were defeated, which is kind of a bummer. But I'm hoping that they can be resubmitted and they can be, approved. And then finally, Todd, I'd like to see Southwest Regional Planning Commission or a group of people show up to these meetings. on behalf of developers such as myself. I was the only one there slugging it out all by myself with my team, but it would be nice, and I will point out that Lisa Murphy did write a very nice letter on behalf of Southwest Regional Planning Commission, which was greatly appreciated. Thank you, Lisa. But I'd like to see bodies, people there. You know, we're going to get there eventually, but there are folks out there. We're never going to change their opinions. We're never going to change their minds, and you know, we've got to work through that. But having some positive voices there to stand up and speak at these meetings would make a lot of difference, I think, in these projects being approved opposed to denied. So I hope that helps, Todd. You know, I am living it, as you said before we broke here. You know, my heart's in this because I know it's the right thing to do. We've got a good process, a good development to continue to build great quality homes in the state of New Hampshire for our residents, because they're needed, and save taxpayers money and time as I do it. But, I'm always open to support you know, any great ideas, so feel free to call on me down the road for input, because I truly believe in this process, and New Hampshire Housing is doing an incredible job for the state of New Hampshire and for the people of New Hampshire, and I'm just proud to partner with them on these projects, and thankful they're as focused and determined as they are to bring these projects to fruition. So that's it from here.
Thanks, Jack. And you know, as folks can probably tell, Jack comes to this issue with a lot of technical knowledge. So I'm glad he's part of this process to contribute that as we move the discussion forward. And I was hearing a couple things there in Jack's comments that speak to the next agenda item, where we'll be talking about potential activities that this group wants to pursue moving forward. But for now, I'm wondering if the other small groups, just for the sake of reporting out, just recognize that we'll have opportunity after the report out to talk more about what we as a group want to focus our energies on. So George, I'm wondering if I can throw it to your group to give a brief 1 to 2 minute report out.
Sure. Yeah, we had really good conversation, and the group sort of overwhelmingly nominated Christine to tell her story. So I'll hand it over to Christine.
Great.
I think where'd she go? Hey, I don't see Christine.
Uh-oh. I'm not.
I think we lost her.
Huh.
I think you had nominated her, George, and she ran away.
Why don't we jump to another group and to keep things rolling and wait for Christine to get back?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
Sure.
betting that her story is a good one.
Sounds good. Sarah, do you mind? I'm not sure. Yeah, I'll throw it to your group.
So we too had some great conversation, and nominated Erica to share her perspective, and she's going to incorporate a little bit from some of the other things she heard.
Great.
I know a lot of you have heard me speak about this before, but basically what I was talking about is exactly what Jack is talking about building affordable housing, and how a lot of times that gets a lot of pushback, but that I'm a numbers person. I have a sociology degree and I failed a lot of math, but I'm a numbers person. So basically, when we're talking about housing and we're talking about the median cost of a 2-bedroom house apartment in Hillsborough County, and actually the whole state, we're talking about a $1,300 number, and George brings those numbers, and that's great. The New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority's numbers are so useful for me in the work that I do, and I think they're really useful in the conversation that we would have going forward, and if we're going to support developers in building this kind of housing, because right now you need $25 an hour to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in New Hampshire. So that's not somebody you don't want living in your neighborhood. That's somebody you absolutely want living in your neighborhood. And actually, even to afford an $800 apartment, you need to be making $16 an hour. That's more than the LNA who's going to be taking care of your elderly parent. That's more than the paraprofessional that might work with your special ed student. So those are just 2 examples of people that you want in your community.
Yeah.
That doesn't even count some of the other folks that we've, obviously this pandemic has really shown who's important. The food service workers at your local school, they worked through this pandemic to feed your kids. They can't afford to live here. So the housing right now also, that's what's really important to know, is we're at below 1% in Hillsborough County and a little above 1% in Cheshire County and Sullivan County for vacancy rates. That means that even if I have all these rental assistance programs, which we have, so I can help people out and pay their rent, there's nowhere to put them. There simply isn't housing for those folks. And I thought it was really interesting that James talked about, he's a young professional, and even he couldn't find a place that was affordable and yet felt safe for him in Keene. And Keene's a nice city. You don't think of Keene as being the kind of place that doesn't have nice housing. So I think that it's really important to remember who we're actually trying to house. And there is a conversation about, we don't want them or those people. And so my conversation was, how do we talk to people? How do we as a group approach people about housing and how it's hard to live here and we need the people who need to live here? So how do we have that conversation? Even when it comes to home ownership, how do we, New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority's first-time homeowners loans are fantastic, but they have to be able to find houses they can afford to even use that loan for, that they need to qualify for that mortgage. So what is the conversation that we have going forward that makes people feel like they're being invited to talk to us about this, so that maybe we can have a change of thought, and really help people see, who are we trying to house here? Who are we trying to include in our New Hampshire community? And when we complain that we don't have enough young people, well, young people can't afford to live here. And so we shouldn't be asking people to live in substandard housing. And how can we have that conversation? So that was my story. And I hope I included, enough folks and how hard it is even for working professionals to rent and afford to move here, to even start to establish themselves, so they might go to that next level and buy a house and become permanent members of our communities. Does that seem right, Sarah? Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Erica.
Were you speaking to me? Yeah. Thanks, Erica.
Yeah, thanks, Erica, for sharing that. And I'm your comments are I'm kind of hearing some potential action items for this group to consider moving forward. So already tackling the next agenda item to a certain extent, but I want to make sure we get to each group. So Lisa, can your group report out next?
Yes, we can, but since Christine's back in here, I think she offers more of a rural perspective than what our group does.
Okay.
We're having Josh Meehan speak, and he's more of the urban. So I'd suggest we listen to Christine.
Yeah, Christine, are you connected with us again?
I have just called in on my phone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Yeah, I don't have the app. My computer's not working. So I shared a few things, some personal experiences with our group. My mother is a senior. She's living in Keene housing right now. Hang on, my computer just started again. Now I have an echo. So she was on a really long waiting list to find housing, and it took about a year, but she is in housing now, thankfully. The other sort of anecdotal thing is my 2 sons are both, one of them just graduated from college, and the other one is a couple years away from that. And I don't know if they'll be able to, certainly my oldest, because of the COVID-19 now, they're both home, but I'm not sure he'll be able to find either a job in his field or housing. And my youngest, I'm not sure where he'll end up, but the other personal experience I've had is my brother a few years ago, when he and his wife got divorced, in order for him to retain partial custody of his son, he needed to remain in the school district. And his ex-wife was the primary income for their family. He was the primary caregiver, and there was nothing that he could afford on a part-time salary. And I would also mention that he is an amputee, so he also has a disability, which limited his options as far as housing and employment. So it was really hard, and he was fortunate that because he was so involved in the community, coaching Little League and doing the chess club and just doing a lot of volunteer work in the community, someone that knew him offered him a place to live that he could afford. So those, even though knowing all of that, I think I was still probably fell into the NIMBY category in my own community. But I started attending the River Center meetings, and I've heard Erica speak very passionately about the challenges that she faces with the people that she works with. And I just started hearing more and more personal stories about people in the community that were struggling, and looked to my own town to see what was happening there. And I just tried to educate myself as much as possible. I started going to any meetings that I could go to, started attending our planning board meetings, just tried to gather, went to New Hampshire housing meetings, and just tried to get as much information I could. I've talked to Carol Ogilvie, I've talked to Karen Hatcher. I'm just trying to get information and share it with our community to see if there was something that we could do in our rural community where there's a lot of resistance to change. And it's been very challenging, but I feel like we've got the conversation going, and I've talked to people one-on-one in the community, and it has had an effect, a positive effect, I would say. So I think we have an opportunity to do something here in Temple, but more needs to be done before we get to that point.
Great. Thanks, Christine, for sharing your story, and also how hearing stories from others has affected your perspective on the issues. And I think that's really important to highlight. Lisa, I think your group is last but not least to report out. So do you mind rounding us out here?
Don't mind rounding us out. Let's, we debated on whether or not we should have somebody from a more rural area, such as Ned Hurlbert, talk from Harrisville side, or Josh Meehan. Do you guys have a burning desire? Which one of you speaks?
You can keep it very brief, so don't feel on the hook for a speech. Just a 1 to 2 minute recap of who you are and why this issue is important to you.
All right, so it looks like Josh is unmuted, so we're going to hear from him first. But then after he's done, Ned, if you can just share from Harrisville, from a planning board perspective, I think that's important too. So thanks.
Okay, well, I'm Josh Meehan, Executive Director of Keene Housing. I hope Christine's mom likes where she's living now. And I've spent about a century being an advocate for affordable housing for people who need it. I came here from Houston, and before that I was at Cambridge, Massachusetts. And what's common in all three of the communities I've worked in, despite the big difference in size, is that the supply doesn't come near meeting the need. And I think many of you have heard me speak before about our wait lists, and depending on where you want to live, your wait is 1 to 5 or 6 years. And we need to do, from my perspective, we need to do more collectively to get that wait list shorter. And like Texas, New Hampshire's tax schema is such that there's not a lot of assistance from the state in terms of financing. NIFA is a great partner and does amazing work with the federal funds that they get and some limited state funds as well. But what that really leaves us with at the municipal level and the town level is zoning and how we think about the rules we make for who can put what where and how that impacts our ability to provide housing for folks who need it at all, not just based on how much money people make, but also, I think Christine alluded to her brother, also the accessibility of the housing that we're building or older stuff that we're trying to make accessible after the fact. So I want to be cautious of the time that we have. So I think from my perspective and Keith's perspective, we need more housing. We need municipalities in the state to use the levers that they do have to make it a little bit easier for us to develop where we can, because as Jack said, the complexity of just putting a new development together, setting aside issues of resistance, both reasonable and less reasonable, it's a lot. And any help municipalities can provide, I think, benefits everybody.
Great. Thank you, Josh. So, Ned, I don't want to deprive you of a quick opportunity just to share with the larger group. Is there anything that Lisa mentioned that you offer a more rural perspective? So I think that's important to include in the conversation. Is there anything you want to share with the larger group?
Well, I'll just say briefly, I'm on the planning board in Harrisville, have been involved in a long-term planning process through Historic Harrisville, which any of you who know Harrisville, Historic Harrisville owns the mills and rents them out, leases them out to tenants, most of whom are business or artists, but it also owns 12 affordable housing units or apartments that it rents from 10 to 20% below market rate. And we still have a housing need because at least anecdotally, we know that when units get offered in Harrisville, there are 20 to 25 people who express an interest every time. Plus, we anecdotally know that there are families who want to send their kids to our K-6 school, and generally they can't find the housing. So that's it in a nutshell. His housing was named as one of the top 3 priorities in the long-term planning process that Historic Harrisville did in the past year. So we've got a need like everybody.
Great. Thank you, Ned. And yeah, thanks to you all to folks who shared and also those who just participated in your smaller conversations. I know we're running a bit longer than I expected, but I think it's important to take the time to learn more about where each of us is coming from. You know, this isn't going to change overnight. So I think building that common understanding at the beginning is important. I do want to make sure we spend a little bit of time on the agenda item number 5, which is really focused on starting the discussion about what we as a regional group, each one of you thought it worthwhile to spend a hot summer afternoon to talk about housing issues. And I think it's important for us as a group to identify what do we want to get out of working together as a group. I invite you to offer big picture goals, or it could be more concrete actions. And just in the comments that I heard in the report out, if I might synthesize some potential actions that I was hearing through the comments, I was hearing, and not everyone might agree with these potential action items or goals, but right now it's just about brainstorming and getting ideas on the table about what this group can do to advance housing issues in each one of our respective communities. So I was hearing, it might be worthwhile thinking about, how state legislation might open up housing opportunities in our communities. And I know folks will probably have varying opinions on, whether that's where we want to start focusing our time. But again, this is just about getting ideas on the table. I was hearing this group could provide a support network for folks who are attending, for example, public meetings where these issues are where the rubber's meeting the road. Oftentimes these can be contentious topics at public meetings. So making sure that housing advocates have support on the ground. Thinking about communication and outreach. How do we communicate to our neighbors what the challenges are and why it's important to address those challenges? So those are just a few of the things that I was hearing in the report out, but I want to invite you all to offer what you want to get out of working as part of this group. So, in the interest of time, I invite folks to either unmute yourselves and offer a comment. There's also the raise your hand feature in the participant menu. You can use that. I'll be monitoring that. Also, feel free to make suggestions in the chat. And again, this isn't the end of the conversation. This is just the beginning. So just to kick things off, I see Karen is raising her hand. So Karen, I invite you to kick things off.
Thank you, Todd. It just occurs to me that there's power in this group, and there's power in the region if we work together. It's really difficult if you're working town by town to deal with the same issues really across town. Everybody wants to think that their little town is different, is unique, is its own thing, but the fact is that it really isn't. It's all the same kind of fear. It's all the same kind of misunderstanding. And all around the state, we have this big issue called not enough housing for the people who want to live here and that we would like to have live here. So, so what I'd really like to see us do is figure out how to use the power of this group to support the things that are going on in each of our towns. To broaden this conversation and to have this one conversation about the reasons why it's important to do this work, and to have these bigger, whether it's through education, through promotional campaigns, through whatever it is, but this idea to raise it up to the level of region for us, because it is a regional issue. That's where I'm starting from.
Great, thanks, Karen. Josh, I see your hand is raised. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Well, I would just like to sort of support the notion of having some sort of legislative agenda, or just making sure not to lose track of how important it is to be involved in Concord. And I wonder about whether or not any of our state senators or House members were invited to be part of this group, or if we would think about that in the future. There is a number of pieces of important legislation that are related directly to affordable housing that were sort of bandied about in the last session, and some stuff came out of it and others didn't. And there were many opportunities for folks to testify. And if we had more organized created an organized approach to watching some of those issues, then the Monadnock region's perspective might be one of the voices that are added to those conversations, and that might be effective.
Great, thanks, Josh. Joanne, I see that your hand is raised. Uh-oh, you and Rich might be fighting against each other to mute or unmute your microphone. I see you're unmuted now.
I don't know what was going on. I unmute and then it would mysteriously mute me again. I just wanted to respond to the legislative piece. I'm on the New Hampshire Planners Association legislative committee, so we spend quite a bit of time reviewing legislation, you know, the hundreds of pieces that come through on an annual basis, and support, oppose, and watch a whole variety of pieces. So I think one of your advocates would be the New Hampshire Planners Association, and I can actually forward you, I'll send to you, Todd, I think our legislative agenda for this past year, and we have been very attentive to housing issues. So I want to, you know, I hope that folks understand that legislation is being addressed at the state level. I also hear what Med's concern is that one size doesn't fit all, and municipalities should have a choice of tools, you know, kind of like a toolbox to adopt for their local community, because what's appropriate in a more urban or suburban community doesn't always necessarily fit in a rural community. But I want to go back to the point that I raised in our lower group, our smaller group. I mean, first off, I'm not opposed to supporting legislative changes. That's how changes is hard, but it's usually pretty good, a good thing to do. But after looking at pro formas and how expensive it is to develop housing of any type, I hear what Jack is saying, and Jack Franks, in terms of finding a model that makes it affordable to build workforce housing. And I think that we also need to support legislation that increases our housing trust fund. So that allows more funding to come in to support affordable housing projects. So I think on a statewide level, we should be looking at that, and those funds could be coming from a federal direction initially as well. And I would like to kind of go back to what Jack and Erica were saying in terms of educating the general public as to who and what workforce housing is. If you're making 25 bucks an hour, or for example, if you take an entry-level job at Millipore here in Jaffrey, you're going to start out at 28 bucks an hour, 2 weeks vacation, full benefits, and tuition reimbursement. There are good jobs out here, but you know, if you can't afford, you know, on a $38,000 income, you can't afford an apartment. So right to Erica and to Jack, I think this group has a burden and a responsibility to educate just exactly who these workforce people are. You know, they're basically us, right? Or our kids. So that's my soapbox for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Joanne. Lots of great ideas.
Todd, can I add something to that, Jack Franks?
Yes, go ahead, Jack.
Yes, great. Yeah, thanks, Erica, Christine, and everyone that spoke, Josh and Joanne. You know, the educational piece of this is very important, but I'd like to point out that it's out of sight, out of mind. Until a developer proposes a project in a region or in a community, it's going to be very difficult to get you know, people educated on this. By all means, the conversation needs to continue. The outreach needs to continue. But again, back to the legislative piece, you know, putting some bite into it for developers in towns that need this, where you've got people that come out in droves. In Swansea, we had 80 or 90 people come out, and they fought against us, and they, you know, convinced the board. Having people there on our behalf would have certainly been helpful. But I think the legislative piece and you know, having folks that are challenging these development projects have to put up some real money, like what was worked on with regard to the bond, you know, having to post a bond, which Josh spoke, you know, of some of the legislation that was defeated. Getting that back out there, getting groups behind this to go up to speak, it's going to be very important. The outreach has got to continue. I think it's, you know, a great way to educate people one at a time or in groups at a time. But you know, a lot of the folks that you know, have these issues or problems don't come out until there's a project in their community, and that's when really people need to that are on our side of the fence here need to step up and to get to those meetings and to help with it. So that's why I made those two suggestions. And I'm hoping that we can put a task force together that'll go around and have those roundtable discussions, have those water cooler discussions with people, or go to the meetings and pull people aside and educate them there while we have an opportunity, while the iron is hot. Because boy, that's critical mass. Developers put up a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of energy to try to get these things done. And if we can get some support legislatively and get some folks that will travel to go to these meetings, I think that's going to make a world of difference while the continuing education process is still going on. Thanks.
Thanks, Jack.
Hey, Todd, could you explain to people how to raise your hand? I think Jim Duffy was trying to raise his hand. You were going like this, or you were waving.
Yeah. So
I've had my hand up for a little bit, Todd.
Oh.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, Matt, if you go ahead, I'll explain in the chat how to use that functionality.
Nobody wants to listen to Jim Duffy.
Ooh, keeping it fresh.
Actually, Jim's a very good friend, very dear friend. We spent Saturday.
Not anymore.
So just a little bit of background, because I'm going to sound like a Philistine, and I don't really want to sound like a Philistine. I was raised in public housing in New York City. My mother was divorced, raising 3 single children during the 50s, when divorce wasn't very common. So I've definitely seen that side of things, right? I personally have built hundreds of houses. From a regulatory standpoint, I've been involved in the permitting and construction of thousands of units, single family and multifamily, condos, townhouses, you name it. I've been involved in the development of land. I've been involved on the city side with, how we manage a city and how we pay for things. So I've got a pretty good spectrum here. And when we talk about this issue, this is why I bring it back to, you really have to take into consideration some of the differences between communities. Different communities have different issues. In Keene, and I've talked to Jack Franks a lot of times about property and development. Keene doesn't really have the ability to absorb big projects like Jack wants to do. We don't really have the available land that's not in floodplain. But zoning wise, we have an awful lot of space potentially, because downtown Keene, you can build 7-story buildings if somebody wanted to do that. Our biggest issue is we have a large quantity of houses within the $150,000 to $300,000 range that are quite elderly in their appearance and how they operate. They're not necessarily energy efficient. They're not necessarily safe. So the program that we need in Keene is not necessarily development, it's redevelopment. We need to, and we're working on right now, trying to put together a couple of projects to do some rather large scale redevelopment, both of the city infrastructure as well as the housing itself. We want the rental housing to be renovated. We want people to be able to go in and buy these houses and live there, but we have to put together, mechanisms to do that. And this discussion cannot be just about development. It also has to be about redevelopment. It has to enable people to be able to renovate their houses, or renovate houses to make it acceptable for low-income housing as well as workforce housing, which we desperately need. So I'm off my soapbox. Hi, George. How are you?
Thanks, Med. No, I think that's a valuable perspective to add to the conversation, thinking about both development of new inventory and redevelopment of our existing housing stock. Jim, do you still have a comment you'd like to share? And we are running a bit long here, so I apologize, but I think I'm going to have to cut it off after Jim. And again, this is just the beginning.
Is that me you're talking to?
Yes, Jim Duffy. Sorry.
I can jump in right now and save even more time if that's okay.
Go for it.
As long as I know thank you. Well, I agree. Legislatively, we need to make some efforts. I agree with most of what's been said and Med with redevelopment. But that's a part of it. It's not an all or nothing thing. And I do sincerely sympathize with Jack Franks, but I really believe that a proactive, grassroots, one person at a time effort to educate on this issue and help people to understand before a big project comes has a lot of value. I also think that, presenting to planning boards, any judicial or not legislative body in small towns to talk about these issues in practical ways that, share the knowledge we all collectively have is very important. But I also think this is a big issue. This is food and shelter. If you think about it, it's not just shelter. Shelter, homes is very important. There are groups in this region working on food security issues. There are already organizations that we can plug in with and synergize with and create a broader consensus amongst people who are not getting what they need, whether it's affordable food or housing, and help people to connect those dots. Because ultimately, this is an economic issue. We create better opportunities for people to live. Everybody's going to benefit in this area. And then just one other brief thing, because this is a huge issue. The water and sewer issue that's predominantly inhibiting developments that we'd like to see in rural communities. I think we also need to really start to pay attention to what wastewater management is and how it's defined traditionally. There are a lot of emerging technologies that might make it a little more feasible in the long time. I know this might be aspirational, but certainly that conversation needs to happen. I know there's like Vermont has living machines, all sorts of ways to filter sewage in ways that don't require that's ultimately a technological and legislative solution, but I don't think it's too early to start talking about that.
Thanks. Thanks, Jim.
I kind of, if you don't mind, if I can take a quick shot at trying to wrap up what I just heard from quite a few people, and that is we need to do a major outreach campaign, and that would include multimedia from a whole different lot of medias. It would include personal stories like we heard today. It would include examples of what multi-unit housing looks like, or infill development. I think if whatever we need to do to dispel that fear, we can do one kind of video with several different parts that can be used in different communities. Because if we can dispel the fear and let people realize that, yes, this is your teachers and your caregivers, that has to start to move things along, and it will certainly help move things along. So I feel like that's our number one strategy that we should be looking at, and seek some funding to be able to do some videos, get a lot of different publicity out of this, and it could be used for any town. Anyhow, that's what I'm hearing, so thank you.
Great, thanks, Lisa. I'm seeing people are having to depart from this meeting, perhaps to attend others or just to maybe eat some lunch. So I do want to wrap things up to talk about next steps. So I'm hearing, this has been a really productive conversation. I think we have a lot of good ideas for specific strategies this group might want to pursue. I see that as being a topic ripe for discussion at our next meeting. Perhaps we'll use a similar format as we use today, because we have folks who are interested in talking about legislation or promotion and marketing, and a variety of different topics. So it's going to be hard for us to hit on every one of those in a big group discussion. So maybe we'll break up into smaller groups and let people really focus on what they are interested in contributing to the overall effort. Look for a recap email, just summarizing what we talked about today, and an invitation to partake in a doodle poll to schedule our next meeting. So appreciate folks hanging in there. I recognize that we ran a little bit longer, but I think covering as much as we did in 90 minutes is quite the achievement. So I'm seeing a comment about finding a regular time to meet. That's something we can, I'll pose in the follow-up communications. So thank you all for participating. Again, this is the conversation that we're having right now is the beginning of a bigger dialogue. So thankful for you taking the time to partake in the discussion today. So I'll leave it at that, and I actually have to jump off soon for another meeting myself. So thank you again. Oh, one other thing: if there are other potential attendees that you think should be invited to the table, I welcome you to send those suggestions to me. State legislators was one suggestion I heard today. If there are other voices that you think should be part of this discussion, I welcome suggestions. So thank you. Bye all, and have a great day. Stay cool.